The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Marcus Johnson, a well-dressed federal prosecutor, slammed the door of his black sedan, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes as he hurried across the courthouse parking lot. The sun was high, casting a golden hue over the town of Crestwood, South Carolina, but Marcus felt the heat of a different kind pressing on him, stress. His heart raced as he glanced at his wristwatch. He was late, again. He'd received a last-minute call about a human trafficking case that demanded immediate attention, dragging him into an urgent meeting with federal agents. By the time it ended, there was no way to make up for the lost time. Now, a more personal matter awaited him inside the local courthouse, an appeal regarding the property tax adjustment on his late grandmother's home. It was a relatively simple issue, but Marcus had a sinking feeling about how today would unfold. Crestwood was a small, conservative town, and the local courthouse was known for its quick judgments and, more often than not, its tough stance on punctuality. Judge Richard Hollis, who presided over this courthouse, was infamous for his unyielding approach to time. It didn't matter that Marcus had been handling a federal investigation. One glance at the clock and Hollis wouldn't hesitate to impose a penalty. Marcus pushed the nagging thoughts aside. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let anything, least of all a late arrival, stop him from getting justice for his grandmother. As he strode toward the courthouse entrance, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was to come. By the time Marcus entered the courtroom, the proceedings were already underway. He quickly scanned the room, a mix of defendants, attorneys, and onlookers, all waiting for their moment to speak. The walls of the courthouse were stained with the years, the dull, chipped paint adding to the sense of stagnation that hung in the air. There was no real hustle in the courtroom, no rush to hear cases quickly. Just a sense of old, oppressive time moving slowly. It was 8:50 a.m. He had made it just in time for his case. He took a seat in the back, his eyes immediately fixing on Judge Richard Hollis, who sat at the elevated bench. Hollis was a tall, sharp-eyed man, his gaze unwavering as he called out names in rapid succession. He barely glanced at the defendants as they approached, already making swift decisions as he flicked through papers with the ease of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. It was clear that Judge Hollis was in complete control of the courtroom, but there was something else in the air. Something that didn't feel quite right. Marcus watched as Hollis handed down sentences to a series of minor offenses. He noted how the judge showed no tolerance for tardiness, except when it came to the white defendants. One man, who was at least 10 minutes late, was granted a polite warning. Another, a young white woman, arrived with a parking ticket and left with only a stern look. No fines, no reprimands. Just an unspoken understanding that there was a certain leniency for people who looked like Hollis. Meanwhile, a black woman was fined $500 for a trivial traffic violation, hardly worth mentioning, yet the judge handed down the punishment with the cold precision of someone who had seen this all before. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen this kind of thing before, but this time, it was different. This time, he was here to challenge it. As Hollis called his name, Marcus stood, his black suit sharp against the worn-out courthouse backdrop. He felt the judge's eyes on him, but he stayed focused, walking to the podium with the steady steps of a man who knew the power of his words. The moment had arrived. As Marcus approached the podium, Judge Hollis didn't even wait for him to speak. "You're late," the judge said sharply, his voice echoing in the otherwise quiet room. "I trust you have an excuse, but that doesn't change the fact that you've wasted the court's time. You know better than to show such a lack of respect." Marcus froze. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, every second stretching out like an eternity. He wasn't prepared for this, not like this. He'd been rushing all morning, fighting to get here on time, but that didn't matter. The judge had already made up his mind. "Your Honor," Marcus said, keeping his voice level, "I was dealing with a federal matter. I'm a prosecutor, and I was called into a meeting about a human trafficking case. That's why I'm late." Hollis didn't blink. "A prosecutor, you say?" His gaze flickered over Marcus, as if assessing whether the title was even worth acknowledging. That's no excuse. The court's time is precious. It's not my problem if you can't manage your schedule. The room fell silent, save for the soft rustle of papers. Marcus clenched his fists, but he remained calm. I understand the importance of the court's time, Your Honor, he replied, his voice measured. But I'd appreciate if you considered the circumstances. Judge Hollis raised an eyebrow, as if Marcus had just made an outlandish request. Consider it all you want. You're still being fined $750 for your tardiness. Now let's move on. The fine hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. A $750 fine, simply for being late. He had no choice but to accept it for the moment, but as he made his way back to his seat, his mind was already racing. He glanced around the courtroom, his eyes catching the looks of the other latecomers, none of whom were being reprimanded in the same way. The injustice was as clear as day. No other defendant had been fined, not even the man who had walked in almost 20 minutes after the proceedings had started. Marcus jotted down a few quick notes on a legal pad, his anger simmering beneath the surface. It was clear now, this wasn't just about being late. This was about something bigger. It was about race. And Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Not in his courtroom. The proceedings continued, but Marcus's mind was elsewhere, caught in the web of injustice he had just witnessed. He leaned back in his seat, trying to focus on the next case, but the sting of the fine still lingered, gnawing at him. His gaze darted around the courtroom, taking in the small but telling details that reinforced his growing sense of unease. There was no question now, Judge Hollis was not just harsh on tardiness. He was biased, applying the law unevenly, depending on the race of the defendant. As the judge called another name, a white man stepped up to the podium, his disheveled appearance and sloppy clothes betraying the fact that he had arrived late. The man mumbled a quick apology, but Judge Hollis didn't respond with his usual scolding. Instead, he waved a hand dismissively. Just don't let it happen again. The judge muttered, then moved on without further comment. Marcus couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man was granted mercy on a simple apology, something he, a federal prosecutor, had not even been allowed to offer before being penalized. The next case didn't make Marcus feel any better. A black woman, no older than 30, was called to the stand. She had been late, too, by just a few minutes, and her case seemed trivial. She had parked in the wrong spot, a minor infraction at worst. But instead of a warning or leniency, Judge Hollis immediately handed her a hefty fine of $500, his voice stern and unforgiving. Marcus watched as she took the hit, her face a mask of resignation. It wasn't just about the fines. It was about how the system, in this very courtroom, treated people differently based on the color of their skin. He had seen it before, on the streets, in local businesses, but never so blatantly in a place of law and order. This wasn't just an isolated incident, this was systemic, and Marcus knew it was time to do something about it. He clenched his jaw, unable to keep his thoughts to himself much longer. He stood up, clearing his throat, and waited for the judge to finish with the next case. The room was silent as all eyes turned to him. Your Honor, Marcus's voice rang out, steady but firm. I'd like to ask a question. Judge Hollis paused mid-sentence, looking over his glasses with a flicker of irritation. What is it, Mr. Johnson? We're running behind as it is. Marcus didn't flinch. I just want to know if the rules of this courtroom are applied equally to everyone. I've seen multiple instances today where latecomers and offenders were treated with different standards depending on their race. I'm simply asking if this court holds everyone to the same measure. There was a tense silence. Marcus could feel the weight of the room's attention bearing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about making a stand against what he had seen and heard. Judge Hollis's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Are you suggesting that I am treating people unfairly based on race, Mr. Johnson? His voice was cold, but Marcus could hear the subtle tremor of defensiveness in it. I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor, Marcus replied, keeping his tone even. I'm just asking for clarity. Are all defendants treated equally, or are there different standards depending on their appearance? The judge narrowed his eyes, his expression darkening with anger. I will not tolerate insubordination in my courtroom. You are here to argue your case, not question the integrity of the court. The fine stands, Mr. Johnson. Now, if you don't mind, we'll proceed. Marcus's frustration boiled over, but he held his ground. I'm not questioning your integrity, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to understand the fairness of this process. He could feel the tension in the room rising as the judge's gaze grew colder. Enough, Hollis snapped. You will pay the fine, or we'll move to the next case. Either way, you're wasting my time. With that, Marcus's patience snapped. He didn't shout, didn't escalate the situation further. Instead, he stood there for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then nodded stiffly and turned toward the exit. As he walked away, the eyes of the room followed him. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the disbelief, the discomfort. But more than that, he felt something else rising within him, a sense of purpose. This was only the beginning. He would not let it go, not until something changed. Marcus left the courtroom with his head held high, but once he stepped outside, he pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were steady as he dialed the number of his colleague, Claire, at the U.S. Attorney's office. The call rang once, twice, and then she picked up. Marcus? You okay? You're late for the meeting. I'll be there in a minute, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. But I need you to run a check on someone. Judge Richard Hollis. I need everything you can find on him, his rulings, any past controversies, the works. Wait, what happened? Claire asked, her tone shifting to concern. I'll explain later, Marcus replied, already heading back into the courthouse. He had made up his mind. This wasn't just about challenging a property tax ruling, it was about exposing something much bigger. He could feel the weight of his badge in his pocket now, the symbol of the authority he wielded. He wasn't just any lawyer in that courtroom. He was a federal prosecutor, a representative of the law itself. Outside, in the cold light of the morning sun, he pulled his badge from his jacket and held it up, letting the silver glint in the light. This wasn't a decision he made lightly, but it was the right one. He couldn't let this slide. Marcus returned to the courtroom, walking through the heavy wooden doors once again, his footsteps firm and determined. When he reached the podium, he took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on Judge Hollis, who was now looking at him with suspicion. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice calm but unyielding. I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Johnson. I am filing a formal complaint against you today for discriminatory practices in your courtroom. The room fell silent, the murmurs of surprise and confusion swirling in the air. Marcus didn't wait for a response. He had already taken out his phone and begun documenting everything, every glance, every word spoken by the judge. He had already started the wheels of justice turning, and there would be no stopping them now. This was no longer about a property tax appeal. It was about exposing a system that needed to be torn down, one piece at a time. And Marcus was going to be the one to do it. Marcus wasted no time. By the end of the day, he had submitted the formal complaint to the local Judicial Review Commission, detailing Judge Hollis's discriminatory practices. The complaint was thorough, outlining not only the unjust fine imposed on him, but also documenting the other disparities he had witnessed in the courtroom. He knew it wasn't enough to rely on just his word. He needed witnesses, people who had seen what he had seen, felt what he had felt. The very next day, Marcus reached out to Claire and asked her to dig deeper. She worked quickly, pulling up public records, interviews, and any complaints about Hollis's conduct that had been filed in the past. Meanwhile, Marcus took to social media, carefully crafting a post that shared his experience without revealing too many details about the case. He needed the public to know that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of racial bias in the courtroom. It didn't take long before the story began to gain traction. A local law student, Jennifer, who had attended the hearing that day, shared her account online. She was just an observer, but her testimony mirrored Marcus's exactly. Others started coming forward as well. A bailiff, who had been working in the courthouse for years, contacted Marcus privately. The bailiff described how Hollis often treated black defendants more harshly than white ones, a sentiment echoed by several other courthouse employees who had seen the bias up close. The local news outlets picked up the story, adding fuel to the fire. What had started as a complaint from one federal prosecutor had quickly evolved into a full-blown scandal. The Judicial Review Commission had no choice but to initiate a formal investigation. The courthouse buzzed with whispered conversations and uneasy glances. Marcus knew things were about to escalate, but he couldn't back down now. He had made his stand, and there was no turning back. As the investigation gained momentum, more and more people came forward with their own stories of discrimination at the hands of Judge Hollis. Marcus, with Claire's help, carefully documented every instance of racial bias, compiling a detailed case that painted a clear picture of Hollis's long-standing pattern of unjust rulings. The testimony from the bailiff was particularly damning. He recounted several instances where Hollis had treated white defendants with leniency, offering reduced fines, granting leniency on minor infractions, or even letting them off with a warning. But black defendants, on the other hand, were fined harshly, often for the smallest offenses, and their pleas for fairness were dismissed outright. As the evidence continued to mount, it became clear that Marcus wasn't just challenging one corrupt judge, he was exposing a wider issue within the local legal system. Activists from across the state joined the cause, rallying outside the courthouse with signs calling for Hollis's resignation and demanding that something be done to address the systemic bias in the legal system. Social media posts went viral, sharing the stories of other individuals who had been unjustly penalized by Hollis. The hashtag Justice for Crestwood became a rallying cry for those seeking reform in the state's courts. Protest became a regular occurrence outside the courthouse, and local politicians began to take notice. The pressure on Judge Hollis grew unbearable. Public scrutiny reached a boiling point, and Hollis found himself fighting a battle he couldn't win. Despite his best efforts to maintain his position, the evidence against him was irrefutable. His resignation seemed inevitable. As the investigation unfolded, Judge Hollis attempted to defend his actions in the press, claiming that he had always made decisions based on the law and that any accusations of racial bias were unfounded. But the mounting evidence told a different story. With every new witness testimony, the foundation of his defense crumbled. The local Judicial Review Commission had already begun to gather its findings, and the pressure on Hollis intensified. A report was drafted that outlined the systemic racial bias in Hollis's rulings, citing the evidence that Marcus and others had brought forward. It wasn't long before Hollis's resignation became a matter of public record. The Judicial Review Commission called for a full overhaul of the courthouse's practices and for a greater emphasis on bias training for all court personnel. Marcus had no intention of stopping at Hollis's resignation. He pushed for further reform, working closely with local lawmakers and activists to ensure that the courthouse would be held accountable. A new, more progressive judge was appointed to take Hollis's place, one who understood the importance of impartiality and fairness in the legal system. Bias training was implemented for all courthouse officers, from the bailiffs to the clerks, and a new oversight committee was created to monitor future cases for racial disparity. The changes were swift, but they were just the beginning. The community in Crestwood, and beyond, began to feel the shift. People who had once been silenced by fear now felt emboldened to speak out against injustice. Marcus had not just challenged a single judge. He had sparked a movement that would reverberate throughout the state. Marcus's fight for justice didn't end with the resignation of Judge Hollis. It was just the beginning of a movement that reverberated far beyond the courthouse in Crestwood. News of his courage spread like wildfire across the country, and soon his name became synonymous with standing up for what's right in the face of overwhelming odds. The aftermath of Hollis's resignation was swift. The courthouse, once a symbol of racial injustice, was now the epicenter of reform. The new judge who took Hollis's place was a breath of fresh air, fair, impartial, and dedicated to the principles of equality. Bias training was implemented for every member of the courthouse staff, from judges to clerks, ensuring that future cases would be treated with the respect and neutrality they deserved. The Oversight Committee, designed to monitor the fairness of rulings, became a permanent fixture in the courtroom, keeping a watchful eye on the system that had once failed so many. But Marcus's work wasn't done. His efforts sparked a wave of change that rippled throughout the state, and eventually, across the nation. As the story of his fight gained momentum, more and more people came forward, sharing their own experiences with racial bias in the legal system. Activists, lawyers, and citizens alike began to demand reforms in their own communities. The movement wasn't just about one courthouse, it was about systemic change in the justice system as a whole. Marcus was invited to speak at law schools, at community forums, and at conferences across the country. His words resonated with people who had long been silenced by fear or indifference. He spoke not only about the injustices he had witnessed but about the need for everyone to take responsibility for dismantling racial bias, not just in the courtroom but in all aspects of society. "I stood up for what was right, not because I was fearless," Marcus would often say in his speeches, "but because I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I didn't." The fight for justice is not one man's fight. It's everyone's. In Crestwood, the courthouse became a symbol of progress. The community, once divided by racial tensions, began to heal. People who had lived in fear of discrimination within the legal system now saw a chance for a future where fairness prevailed. But it wasn't just the courthouse that had changed, it was the people, too. They had witnessed what could happen when someone dared to challenge the status quo. And they had learned that justice wasn't a privilege, it was a right. The reforms that began in Crestwood spread to other cities, small and large, across South Carolina and beyond. States implemented similar bias training, and courts began to adopt more transparent practices, making sure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The legal profession started to reflect more on its own flaws, and many began to view Marcus as a trailblazer in the fight against systemic injustice. For Marcus, the work was never truly over. The path to equality was long, and the battle for justice required constant vigilance. But he had ignited something powerful, a spark that couldn't be extinguished. He saw it in the faces of young lawyers, in the energy of the protesters who took to the streets, and in the families who finally felt heard by a system that had once silenced them. As the years passed, Marcus continued to speak out, to challenge the systems that perpetuated inequality, and to mentor those who would carry the torch after him. His role as a leader in the fight for justice had become a lifelong commitment, one that went far beyond the courtroom. The ripple effect of his actions spread like waves, not just in Crestwood, not just in South Carolina, but across the entire nation. And while the fight for equality was far from over, Marcus knew that the future was bright. Because every day, someone new was standing up, challenging the injustices of the past, and demanding a fairer world for the next generation. And Marcus? He had become a symbol of what it truly meant to fight for justice, not just with words, but with action. His legacy was not one of a single victory, but of a movement that would never stop pushing, never stop growing, until the world was a place where fairness was not just an ideal, but a reality. The story of Marcus Johnson is not just the story of one man fighting for justice. It is a story of courage, hope, and belief in the power of change. Marcus stood up not only to protect his own rights, but to challenge a system that had long failed to uphold fairness and equality. His battle was about creating a more just world, where everyone is treated equally, regardless of race or status. Though this struggle was never easy, Marcus proved that one person can make a difference. The changes that began in Crestwood spread across the nation, igniting a flame of hope in communities long silenced and oppressed. Every step Marcus took, every small victory in the fight against injustice, serves as a reminder that fairness is a right for all people. Marcus's journey does not end here. It is only the beginning. Because in this fight, each one of us has the potential to be the change. With enough courage, perseverance, and faith in justice, we can create a future where justice is not just an ideal, but an unbreakable reality. For Marcus, this story is just the start. And for all those who follow in his footsteps, justice will remain the guiding light, no matter how long the road may be. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and watch the video. Your support means the world to us, and we're grateful for each and every one of you who joined us on this journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with your friends and family. Your feedback and support help us bring more content like this to life. Stay tuned for more, and together, let's continue to spread the message of justice, equality, and positive change. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.